the most impressive and beautiful frames in the entire film were in the film the very moment of its conception.
Let's hit the Spider-Man. I'm really excited
Okay, yeah.
to hear what you have to say.
Due to our not wanting to get DSCM or DMCA'd, we put together a bit of like a PowerPoint presentation that you can bring up here. And it's just pretty much a few photos and screen grabs that I grabbed that will kind of highlight what they've done in the series. So first of all, you saw this movie, right?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I was
Oh my
actually
God.
super
me,
late in
Ken?
watching it. It's actually super. I watched it 3 years after it came out, or like
Wow.
yeah. I think it's
So
been out
this
for-
year?
I watched it maybe a year and a few months ago. Like it's pretty
Okay.
recently.
It came out
So maybe
2018, no?
so maybe a couple of years. Maybe a couple of years.
Yeah.
The time frame might be wrong, but I had a lot of other artists tell me that this film was amazing. And actually, the reason I didn't watch it wasn't because I didn't want to. I'm a massive Spider-Man fan, but I just never found the time to sit down and really like. I knew I wanted to enjoy it, right? So I had to like plan time where I'm just watching it and just focusing on it.
Yeah, I gotcha.
But when I finally saw it, man, it freaking blew me away. Holy! I think it's the best Marvel movie, like hands down right now. Period. Best
Definitely
superhero
trending in
movie,
that direction.
at least in my opinion, and also just how much they really push the boundaries in so many different ways. And and I'll get into a little bit of this, but the film takes a lot of risks, like not just like the kind of risks in terms of storytelling, but they take a lot of risks with the whole animation process. I mean, you've seen it. They do a very unique blend of actual 3D, but they accentuate it with style, like classic comic book styling, like adding in halftones and stuff. So I wanted to get a little bit into what they did specifically in terms of the animation and rendering. So if we go to the next slide here.
Bam.
So the first thing that most people will notice is this movie. If you download this movie or can stream it, if you pause at any moment, it's every frame is a painting, and this isn't something that you can do with all movies because most movies, especially with like real life movies, they have blur on. Just the natural blur that our eyes kind of sees translated through the camera, but in Spider-Verse they don't do any actual blurring. And instead, to get this effect for depth of field, they pretty much do a technique called chromatic aberration. Have you ever heard of this technique before?
Usually in games, yes.
Yeah, so it's gotten a little bit more popular in games. Essentially, what it is if you imagine that like this is a pixel, right? And then what they do is they split that pixel into two, and then they hue color shift it while offsetting it a little bit. So you can kind of imagine what it looks like. It's the same thing what it looks like when you watch a 3D film. That red and blue kind of. If you watch it without the glasses, you'll see two images overlaid each other: a red one and then a blue one, right?
Sort
It's
of like
very
our logo.
Kind of exactly like our logo, actually. Probably heavily inspired by this movie because I took a lot. I took a lot of from this movie when I did an earlier analysis on it. So what they did was that if you look over in Miles' shoulder, the reason I highlighted this particular part was because Miles is sharp and in the middle here, like on the left side. And then if you look over his shoulder, you see the background and you can see that chromatic aberration that they did. And that allows your eye to mimic the type of focusing that happens for when you see something that's blurry and you see something that's close. Because when your eye focuses in on a particular distance, maybe someone that you're talking to, in this case, like maybe where Miles is sitting, everything else becomes a bit blurry. And you'll notice this is the same thing with like digital cameras. They have a specific focal range that you're always tuning based on how far the subject is from the camera. And then things that are further or closer within that range will be a bit blurry. And then use that same level of like kind of shift, but they just have it so that they shift the overall image instead. So what this allows is that every image, there's none of that actual kind of weird smudging that kind of happens when you do it with traditional film. So if you pause a regular movie, you'll see that like there's a lot of frames where everything looks just completely smeared, and you don't really know what's going on. That's because they're trying to reconstruct the way your eye would see in real life, because your eye won't be able to properly capture everything in perfect, like, crisp frame by frame by frame. The human eye works in terms of it blends it all together, and it gives you like this idea of motion. So because this film didn't do that, it had to do so many things to compensate, because blur is such a important part of how we perceive any kind of visual media. So if you take it away, you have to put in a whole bunch of things to compensate so that it still looks good. Because if you just did this in any other film and you took away the blur, it looks extremely strange, and things start to begin to look a little sometimes like out of proportions. Things might look a little too big, look a little too small, and it just looks odd overall. If you go to the next frame, this will be another example of this type of blurring that they do. But instead of just blurring with chromatic aberration, you see on the left side here, this is the image that ended up in the film, and on the right side is the original like pre-post production image of the 3D scene.
So in the left image, there's a subway train and what looks like a filter overlaid on top of it.
Yeah, so this is a combination. Part of it is the chromatic aberration that we just talked about, and then another is something called like a halftone. It resembles if you ever looked at newsprint, the way that they print the images. It has like these little raised bumps because they do dot inking, and
Gotcha.
so it's just trying to get the aesthetic feel of a comic book. But what they do is that what regular depth of field does is essentially blurs things in the background, making all the shapes simpler, and making things a bit harder to see. And so what this film does is that it decides to just stylize things in the background instead, and manually simplify those shapes, right? To use in tandem with the fact that they don't actually have blur on, right?
Gotcha.
So because they took blur out, they had to replace it with these other techniques. But because they are specific about the techniques they replace, they use it to like stylize things to make it feel like a comic book, or to other storytelling effects. We'll get a bit more into it with the other examples. If you go to the next frame,
a quick question before we move over, because I'm actually curious about this. In this right photo here, with the train without the filter on top of it, is that a photograph or is that an actual painting?
So that's a 3D model. Although the textures that they use, sometimes they use photo textures, because there's a lot of materials here that are rendered like realistically, like the metal is rendered realistically. There's a bit of an example later on, but because like if you look inside the train's interior, you'll notice that it's a very simplified, almost just like a 2D drawing. Like they do this all the time. They don't actually need to fill the depth because they know the background is going to be so far away. They don't have to model in depth this train. And so I guess you can call them developers or animators, the team that worked on this, they talked a lot about this, because on one hand, a lot of people praised them for how ingenious this idea was, but they also said because it was much more of a logistics thing, because it saved them so much work in terms of having to actually model things or detail things in the background. Anyways, so this is the same shot. It's a little darker on the left side because they're trying to this particular screenshot's highlighting Miles on the right there. But essentially what they do is that they use it to make the audience focus exactly where they want them to focus, even though the scene is quite busy or they need to showcase a very messy environment. They use it as a tool to direct the audience's eye specifically to where the story really should be. So all the sharpness will usually revolve around our characters, especially our foreground characters.
So this is like a panning shot.
This is just just a I'm not just calling it a wide angle shot. I love the composition of this because in this part of the story, Miles is just, I believe he just found out, or Peter just died. I could be wrong in the exact timing. So he's feeling like small and kind of insignificant. So they have him off in the side of the frame because he's not a major player in the story just yet. Yeah. So another thing that this film did, so this style that they had, the reason that they wanted to go with this particular style is because they wanted to infuse as much of the energy of the comic books as much as possible. And I've heard the animators use this phrase. They wanted to have it be more about taste over reality or realism. So the idea is that while the computers can render much more accurate and realistic depictions, humans have better taste in how things should look, and how things should feel, and the style, and have control over the style. So when they were making these decisions for the art style, but as well as the storytelling, they always emphasize the taste side of it over whether it was realistic or not. You can kind of see it, and there's like a bunch of parts that I always kind of picked at that I always thought was funny. And one was that like Miles walks up walls, but he has full runners on, and like how do you like, does the feet little hairs go through the shoes or something? How is he sticking on there? But they don't care. It's more about the taste and having him have his sneakers as a part of his style, and so they would rather make that decision instead. So in addition to one thing that it's going to be a common theme about this movie and this production that I found so impressive is that they would have these technical challenges to overcome, but in overcoming it, they managed to add like a unique. They managed to take something that would be a problem, but also turn into what was essentially a strength for the film. And another one is because they were doing this kind of comic book style and having this halftone overlay for shadows and stuff like that. They were able to splice in these kind of shots. If you go to the next shot here, they were able to splice in direct like 2D comic book drawings into their movies, and you'll probably remember they had so many of these shots. Yeah, like these are like if you remember that scene in Fight Club where he talks about he splices in like clips and no one really notices.
Yeah,
this is kind of the exact thing that they have. So there's all these action shots this is directly from the movie, and this is just like this is just a frame that's shown for maybe a frame or two during the actual
You're kidding.
movie. Yeah, just like half a second. And
wow,
you don't even notice because it's supposed to be a part of the action. And there's tons of examples of this kind of splicing in here, and it feels so natural though because your eye has been looking at these halftones and shapes all the time. Like if you look at the bottom image and you see these horizontal lines that they're using for shading, if you in other images of the environment, they just have those horizontal lines painted on manually to shade, or to make like a tree might cast that kind of shade anyways. So your eye is so used to seeing these lines, and I think it just makes it so natural in terms of when they cut to these images that you don't even recognize something's off. It just looks like it's actually in place because the shapes and the artistic language they were using is consistent in both frames, but you notice more of the 3D in the main rendering style of the movie.
So how does that help with the image then if you don't even recognize what you have seen?
It adds the action part of it. You feel it though. It's the same kind of thing that doing something just for. I think that's one of the greatest parts of this movie is that a huge component of animation is all about building up to like a certain moment or like a certain pose. For example, animators often talk about keyframe or key poses, right? Because they know that when you're making an animation feel good rather than feel realistic, it's very important for them to hit these like little moments, and you can see them in the film because they put so much effort into something that only exists for a few frames. And so this is one of those examples. If you go to the next one, this is another example because you see the lines that are drawn not just on Gwen's kicking motion here, but also on the motion lines that are on her feet. Like these subtly, like if you were just to watch this without them, it'll
Mm.
still feel good, but because it's a frame by frame shot, like in terms of their movement, they're snapping from frame to frame. If you don't have these lines in a comic, it would never work because it would just look like they were maybe falling or just standing there. But if you add those lines, it adds to that 1 second read in a comic, or
Mm-hmm.
like for example in this moment, the kicking moment, because this frame exists actually for just one frame, but every frame in this like kicking part here, you could freeze and they'll have these like these exact little lines here, like a little line for
Mm.
when she got smacked, a little line for how her arm is moving, and it all adds together for when you actually see the punch. It feels so comic booky somehow, and it
Mm-hmm.
has so much more motion. And that's what was so impressive about this movie, was that they really knew that you didn't, not just that you didn't have to have a high level of value of production in throughout your entire movie, but there are key moments where you have to spend a lot of resources, even though it's only a few frames. You know, like
Mm-hmm.
there's always, if you look at a lot of kind of like lower level TV animation, and especially if you know anyone in TV animation, sometimes the shows, it's all about like how much it costs and how much, like we can't have too many characters because it's going to take too many hours to animate all these characters, blah blah blah, etc etc. And
Yeah. Yeah.
you really feel that in the story, and you really feel that in why it makes that like a lower class or a lower tier animation, is because they're constantly trying to work through this budget. Whereas in Spider-Verse, even though like it looks like a massive production, if you break things down and you look at how they do everything, everything was very like cheap in terms of they spent all the resources exactly where they really needed to get the most of it out of everything. Um
Very cool. Very
yeah,
cool.
yeah. If you go to the next frame, I just want to take a look because I can't remember. Yeah, this is just another example. You see the little lines coming out of Peter's head for
Yeah.
the
Spider sense.
spider sense. Like you can't really do that in another movie and have it feel natural. Like you can't really imagine a Pixar movie like you're watching Toy Story, and then they have these kind of like little effects come up. You know, it
Mm-hmm.
feels like it's so out of place. But this movie blends it into all of its regular effects. Like maybe someone's gonna get like a bomb explodes. They're actually gonna, if you pause the moment when like an explosion happens, they're hand drawn effects, hand drawn 2D effects on
Mm.
per frame. So that was another thing, is that almost they had so many hand drawn effects over every frame that if you went through this movie and paused, you, I think they talked about this in one of their animation interviews. Is that every frame had hand drawn animation on it, or hand drawn effects, or hand drawn shading on it, every single frame. So it was just really really impressive to me.
So is the only 3D part of the movie the actual characters, and then everything is drawn on top?
There is a blend, and they do the blend a lot. I'm gonna get into a little bit later about some of the effects they do for per character. But for example, both Penny and Peter Porker are actually 2D purely.
Oh, what?
Yeah, 2D purely.
Cool.
With Penny, I don't know if Penny they use some sort of flattening rig technique, and it's actually a 3D model, but then it renders like it's a 2D effect, like it's because she looks kind of like a South Park character, like a paper cutout
Mm.
kind of
Mm.
effect, right?
Is that what a flattening rig is?
Well, the rigs in animation, especially for 2D, have gotten so advanced. So before you would have these IK rigs that were more like if you imagine sticks of paper, and then you put pins in them and they kind of like rotate around them, right?
Okay.
Then
Was that
there-
like rotoscoping?
Not rotoscoping is a different thing. It's like the idea of masking, but this is more like having basic puppets, right? That but are
Okay.
just 2D cutouts, like very much like South Park. If you imagine
Uh,
how you would animate in South Park, and then the newer animation techniques, they actually are 3D characters that allow you to do complex things, like having a turning character is really difficult in a 2D rig because you have to, the rig isn't designed to draw the body at different angles. But
Mm.
having a 3D rig that is translated to 2D, you can actually rotate it, and then the software should properly flatten that rig for you to keep that effect. So you don't have to
Okay.
draw, like, say, example, my hand. If I'm rotating it like this, there's so many different angles that you would have to draw in a 2D rig. But in a 3D
Mhm.
rig, because the hand's already modeled, all these angles are actually already calculated. If that makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then they just take those 3D points and compress them down to a single plane?
Or they do a rendering or shader that accounts for it. Like, if this is something that Borderland does, they have a lot of effects that are designed around 3D models, but the end result is actually a 2D line, like a stroke or something like that.
In Borderlands, you said?
Yeah, in Borderlands. So Borderlands is a very similar. They use a lot of very similar techniques, but they actually they use a lot of some. You would almost say that Borderlands pioneered a few techniques, or at least the ideas, because they obviously came up before this movie, and then that was the first kind of one of the earliest forays into attempting to try to make animation but in 3D, because that was always a big hurdle. We have a lot more examples now, especially with this film, this being the high watermark of having 3D but also taking the strengths of the 2D animation, right? Because the problem of this movie was all in 2D and all of it was done by hand is that it would cost like an unfathomable amount of animation hours. And you see this actually in Japan, because they're starting to turn out a lot of more 3D effects, because before there was just like slave houses of animators that had to like hand animate so many things. And
Studio Ghibli's of Japan.
Studio Ghibli of Japan's, but like before the innovations, like all animation had to be this way. So even cheap level animations, which, you know, had a trade-off, because on the one hand they were beautiful. They had so many amazing animations, but they also, man, there's so many people that had to work on them that, you know, certain projects were just unfathomable because they would take too many man hours. Even Studio Ghibli, like one of the things that's so impressive about them is that they are able to keep that old school style at all and still have this.
Well, they also take 7 years to make a film.
Yeah, they take forever to make a film. Exactly, it's a very like classic and traditional art house. If the next slide is another example of a very similar thing. So you see the outline on Miles here on his feet. It's essentially they're using the same techniques that they did on with the chromatic aberration for the background, but because they apply it in the background, they can now just use that technique everywhere, and it just kind of feels normal in this scene. Like this is in the very end, which he's in the reactor. And we probably should have said this is spoiler wording, but the movie's been out for quite a while. Yeah, so if you don't know, he fights the Kingpin at some point.
He got this far and didn't realize it.
Yeah. Okay. So the next thing I want to talk about is I talked about it a bit, but it's the halftone shading that we had. If you go to the next frame, this is a frame from WALL-E. And I picked this frame because it's just an atmospheric frame, and I wanted you to see the difference in terms of how atmosphere and mood is rendered in a classical 3D animation style. And then if you go to the next frame, you see this is much more of what they did. If you look closely at the shadows, they're actually just a bunch of halftones. It's cross-hatching everywhere. And just think about this. Okay, so let's say that these two shots accomplish the same mood. You know, like they're both able to show atmosphere, show kind of which historically in movies and video games has been something hard to do. It was one of the first kind of like technical feats people had to kind of achieve in 3D, because proper fog and atmosphere was actually kind of like hard to render. If you just look at old Reboot, like Reboot had no atmosphere like whatsoever. You could see into the distance forever, right? So if both of these screens accomplish the same thing, but Spiderverse does it for an unfathomable amount cheaper, because all they're doing here is flat 3D rendering, right? And then they have 2D panels or hand-drawn, people doing hand-drawn shadows over top of it. Whereas in WALL-E, if you just go back to that previous slide for a second, just imagine how much work it was to model everything in this scene, and then to texture it, and then to make it all those textures realistically. That actually has such a high amount of overhead that only a studio like Pixar could handle it. Whereas if you go to if you go to the next frame where we were just at, this was done on their end because they didn't have enough manpower to make this movie, and they had to kind of quote unquote cheat out. But they found a way that accomplishes almost even better, because now it's a part of this unique style that they're creating, but it's so much faster, and it also allows them to iterate. Like they are able to make these animations shorts and clip them together with rough effects and to get the feel really early on, super cheap, rather than Pixar, who has an entire render farm dedicated to rendering out daily, so they know, Wally looks good here or the effect looks good there. Oftentimes, especially if you look at like big movie productions, big 3D movie productions, you won't see the entire thing put together until like 3/4 into the project, where finally the effects get to put in, and the cloth sim gets to put in, and the hair sim gets to put in. There's so many players that go into there that, and then what if you get it wrong? What if you get that sequence and it doesn't feel right? How long does it take to kind of fix that?
Just the iteration over it alone.
Yeah. So that's one of the techniques that they did, the halftone shading. And then the another thing this is something that's actually kind of it's kind of obvious, but a lot of people already, not obvious, but a lot of people have talked about it already. It's the fact that this movie is animated on 1s and 2s. Have you heard of this kind of concept before?
No.
So, if you go through the movie frame by frame, you'll notice that certain things move every frame, and certain characters and things move every other frame.
Oh, okay. Yes. Okay.
Right.
Now I know what
Exactly. So 1s are every frame, 2s are every other frame. And if you watch a movie there's been a debate in terms of what's better or what's the right thing to do, but films that are in 1s feel smoother, but films that, or like animations that are done in 2s, the action feels more crisp, and it feels like and if you watch this movie, you'll notice that not everything, like you feel some characters kind of like blip, almost like you're watching an animation, even though they're 3D characters, but because they're popping in 2s instead, it makes their movements feel like the way that your eye would see someone that's moving really fast. You would lose them for a second, and then you would catch them again in these moments, and that's what animating on 2s allows you to kind of mimic, right? And so this movie, they found a way to do both at the same time, which sounds like it wouldn't be that hard, but when you're talking about things on a large production like this, it becomes really difficult because you have 2 pipelines now. Like, do you, and I'll tell you one area that's particularly difficult is if you imagine physics sims, because they use physics sims here a lot. If one physics sim, you don't simulate what happens in every frame, like how do you match 2 things that you have that one thing only moves in every other frame and another thing moves every frame, right? And so they actually showed this example of like say there's a cloth on top of a ball, and then one ball is moving up on 2s and one ball is moving up on 1s, and then obviously the ones on 1s looks smoother and looks like it works properly, but on 2s, because it's kind of popping, the sims think that it's actually like accelerating and then moving the cloth upwards, so it gets all jank. So they had an entire pipeline that would automatically convert all their rigs so that their sims could it would essentially find the in-betweens for the frames that should have been there. So if he moves from here on frame 1 and then goes to here on frame 3, the rig auto builds where it should have been on frame 2, just for the simulations that they use on ropes and cloth and everything like that.
Gotcha. That's cool.
So another thing that they did, if you go to the next frame, a part of this process here, because they're animating on 2s, what you would normally do in a comic book, if you wanted to show someone maybe punching someone super fast, they would have multiple limbs, like their arm would be here and then also like over here. In the movie,
I've seen JoJo.
Yeah, exactly, right? Like, you see the Chun-Li kick in Street Fighter. It's exactly the same thing, right? But, because they're animating on 2s, they wanted to get that effect. And they would actually have the rigs, like I showed you here, with multiple hands, because they would hack. This is a direct screen from the movie. If you pause, you'll see this exact frame. And they didn't give a care. They didn't care at all, because this is the same thing.
It's like Miles with like 2 hands.
Yeah, it's taste over reality, because the taste of it is that when you see this in action and you don't freeze it, it feels like he went from one action to another action to another action, even though you don't see that, right? You see his hands kind of clipping, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is another example of them taking something that is a technical challenge to them, animating on 1s and 2s, and then exploiting that technology that they like, this little like technology strength that they've kind of developed now, because they can animate on 1 and 2s. Now they can take advantage of techniques that you would only do on 2s or you would only do on 1s in the same movie. And the most famous example of this, and it's been talked about a lot, is there's a scene where Peter Parker is teaching Miles how to swing for the first time. You might have heard of this at all. Have you heard of this?
No, this is new to me.
Okay, so if you look at that scene, Peter, because he's like, Spider-Man already, he's animated on 1s and he's very smooth. And then Miles is animated on 2 and he's struggling and he's like bouncing around. And then there's a moment where they swing together and they actually slowly bring Miles into the 1s. And then suddenly they're in sync and they're both animated on the same. And not only do they do the 1s and 2s, but if you look at the particular frames, they're offset. So like, Peter might be moving on like this on 1 and then Miles is moving on 1.2 or 1.4. He's just like, his frames are slightly off, so they're never in sync. And this is something that they talked about it a lot because it's awesome, and you don't even notice it. But if you watch that part again, you'll definitely pick it up.
That's really cool. Yeah.
Okay, so the next part I'll get into is we talked about the technical rigs, right? So this is another thing that they did with the rigs for, like, we were mentioning how people would use 3D rigs to go 2D. This is the opposite. How we use 3D rigs, 2D elements, but in our 3D rigs. So go to the next slide here. What you'll notice is, this isn't the slide, but this is just an example of another cheat that they do. They have all their rigs are designed to get extremely broken. His arm is so stretched in this one frame, but this is just for stylistic effect. The same thing with having the extra hands. Anyway, so the next one is the one I want to talk about. So here. So one thing that I thought was so cool when I learned about it is I want you to just look at the facial lines that are shown up here.
Yeah, like his brow and his mouth.
Yeah, so they used a combination of both actual rigs on the model. Go to the next frame for a second. So the animators had control over these specific like wrinkles and stuff. And so this is another thing that they did, not just because it was a stylistic choice, but otherwise they would have to actually have that in the geometry or in the normal map, that those wrinkles and they would never just look as good as a simple line that's in a comic book, right? So they have the rigs set up for one to have these lines, but the most impressive part to me, I wonder, did I have a slide for? No, I did. So what they did was that they wanted to have a program that would automatically create some of these lines on the face. So they have specific controls here for the eyebrows, but the nose, for example, all that was generated by a combination of pre-drawn images and machine learning.
Really?
Yeah. So what they did was they took Miles's face and they took multiple angles, right? And then they had the artist manually draw in where they would draw the lines for the nose. And that's going to change at every angle. Like every artist will tell you that, like, as soon as it turns one inch over here, you have to draw a different type of line, right?
Okay.
So what they did was they got someone to hand draw it, right? And then the machine would take these, kind of like they would do with blend shapes in other games, and it would build a profile for Miles so that when he's on the screen and it's at this particular angle, the computer thinks it should be this particular line. And then that's already really cool. And then on top of that, there would be someone who would manually fix any lines that were off, because they would, it's not perfect, but they would use that information to teach the computer to do that line properly next time. So they
basic machine learning, always iteration, always learning.
It's crazy to me that they were using this kind of technology. So then
that's awesome.
So many of the scenes that even though they had all this hand drawn stuff, so many of it was also like generated for them, and then all they did do is just tweak it a little bit.
That's really cool.
That was one of the most.
Is this all stuff they developed specifically for this movie? They hadn't. Nothing was inherited. Nothing was already existing.
I'll get into this a little bit later, but the project was actually kind of crazy. Like I when I first saw the movie, and I'm thinking about like what kind of studio would have, like I would think it'd be like a studio like Pixar, like like a project like that where, you know, they have this idea and they have this major backing and we have like, you know, this like massive infrastructure to create the movie. But it was actually a bit like chaotic because they had one art director and then eventually they removed him and then they had another art director. And I think eventually there was 3 art directors on the project and the teams actually turned over a lot. But what was really, really impressive to me was that it seemed like everyone who took over the project, unlike in some other projects, they didn't disrespect what the previous person did. Like I've seen so many projects where someone takes over and then they say we have to do something different because, you know, I'm the new guy. Like I know the right thing to do. Like
the new boss can never be the same as the old boss.
Yeah, exactly, right. But it seemed to me, I'll get into this a bit later, but every time, if you look at what was the original inception of this movie, they kept so many elements to it. Yeah, I'll get into it a little bit. I just want to move on to one more particular technical aspect, or 2 more. If you go to the next slide here, this is just another example of their decisions to go for taste over reality. So this is a kind of a famous shot in the movie, right? This is this is the non-rendered version, so it's just the Maya file with the 3D models that they use with the animations, right? And then the next slide is what the city actually looks like in the Maya file. It's like it's like a giant mess that like is completely impractical of how the city works. And the city
rectangles and cylinders, none of them connected to the ground, all just jumbled together like twigs in a hay bale.
At random angles, but it's all designed to mimic the New York skyline because, you know, Spider-Man's famously from New York. But even in the movie, they would grossly exaggerate New York buildings all the time. Like some buildings would be like 100 feet taller than like any building would normally be, but they all used it to kind of just make the feel of the movie feel right. And then the next scene here, we talked a little bit about before, or the next slide, the team, this is just like, so first off, this is a beautiful shot period of so-called like the New York cityscape, but
Is this a painting or are these 3D
this is a
models
frame.
for the cars? This is a painted frame.
This is those are 3D models from the car, right? This is a combination though, and we can't quite zoom in, but if you look at this image, the further away something is, the more 2D it actually is. So the cars in the front are 3D models. The background, if you look at the purplish pink hue background, they're actually just blobs of paint. Like they're just rectangles and little like lines here and there. And then so what this is just what I'm just trying to illustrate here is that the art mastery at the high level in terms of the project and art directors is so strong because they know exactly at what point it doesn't matter anymore. Like if you try to do this, but say for example you started to use blobs of shapes, but for like the bus on the right or the car on the left, like we're all gonna know that this is off and you're trying to like pass off a 2D drawing. But they pick the right moment in terms of the distance where it just becomes like it doesn't matter anymore because the human eye wouldn't properly see it anyways. And then when it becomes a blur like that, things in the distance just become more of a feeling to you, more so than like a specific shape. And so they take great advantage of it. And the next slide is another example of this. So in this slide, everything here is realistically rendered, but except what's in the bus. The bus is a 2D painting of people just standing there. And because they know this is a quick frame, this bus isn't going to, this is just like maybe an action sequence where Spider-Man's running down the middle of the street.
Yeah.
But you know, look at like no one would notice, right? Like no one would notice. They saved, I don't know how many ungodly amounts of hours to like not have to have people in that bus.
Yeah.
And
even like more suggestions of people, they're all elongated and stuff.
Exactly. So one of the, like if you become an animator or you begin to draw, one of the things you'll realize is that when you copy from just real life, there's something that you realize the pros and masters do is that they add to real life when they're drawing it. If you look at the Disney animations, like they have motions, people don't move actually like how they do in real life. They move exaggeratedly, but just enough for you to get the hint of it. And so that's a common theme throughout the decisions that they made in this movie, is that the gesture of everything is more important than the actual image or reality of what it is. Yeah, so that's kind of like the last little bit of technical stuff that I wanted to showcase. And then I just wanted to get into, like, I love the characters that they decided here. Specifically, all 5 characters was, like, we talked a bit about the risks that they took in the movie. I'm not sure if this is a bit of a risk because it's obviously like a part of the Spider-Verse story and comic book, but they just did I think it's just hard. Like, it would be so hard to do an animation movie where you're doing this kind of experimental art style that's never been done before, and then you also have to incorporate essentially 3 or 4 more art styles into the same scene, in the same environment. So I want to talk about each of the Spider men or women, Spider people, right? First off, we have from left to right, Peter Porker, the Looney Tunes style one.
The amazing Spider-Ham.
Amazing Spider-Ham, and they talked a lot about in the movie how they wanted to keep, like, Gwen, Miles, and Peter B. Parker from the same type of, like, reality. The laws of physics works in a certain way. But Peter Porker exists in Bugs Bunny's universe, and so they let him do, like, ridiculous things in the movie, like float around, and he carries, like, a giant, like, mallet out of nowhere, and like an anvil falls in someone, like, what's going on? But they don't care. They're just like, okay, taste over reality, and it fits perfectly. But one of the things about this character that I love, so they have this moment in the movie, and it's one of the most important moments for Miles, because it's when they tell him that they need to leave him behind because he's not ready to be Spider-Man yet, or he's not Spider-Man yet. He's just, like, pretending right now. And if you remember, like, every time Peter Porker talks, it's a joke, right? And then they give him one of the most poignant and serious lines of the entire movie. And it's when he tells him that, like, the thing about being Spider-Man is that you can't save everyone, right? Like, this massive understanding about, like, people are going to die, and, his uncle just died. And so, like, why would you ever decide to give the comic relief character this line? Like, it turns to him, and I'm expecting a joke, and he gives you this heartfelt line that works so well. Like, it's just like, it's a part of what they did was that they wanted to illustrate that each Spider person was the same good person on the inside, even though they're so vastly weird and different, right? And so they all have a moment to show the audience why they are, like, the good Spider-Man, not like a villain in this movie, but like the hero of the movie in their own movie, right? So Peter Parker was great. Gwen is awesome. Like, one of the best portrayals of just, like, a female character. I just loved her so much. And she in terms of, like, if you were to rank the Spider people in terms of their careers, she's at, like, the particular prime compared to all the other Spider-Men. Like, Miles is just starting off. Peter B. Parker is essentially a has-been Spider-Man that's just struggling to, like, get his life back together, right? And so she's actually in the peak kind of heroic ability,
zenith.
right? Spider Zenith, right? And Penny, Penny Parker is a particular favorite of mine because they had their choice of who to pick for the Spider-Verse. If you look at the Spider-Verse comic book, they have a lot of Spider-Man to pick from. They have a lot, right? And I feel like they picked her because, like, to me, it's a acknowledgement of of what Japanese animation has, like, done to the field. Because like, it's undeniable that Japanese animation, manga, whatever you want to call it, has, like, a certain edge and appeal that is just not existent in, like, Western animations. You don't have, like, a Dragon Ball Z or, like, any kind of, like, crazy hype fantasy stuff in the West, right? They had, let's be honest, like, if you were just looking at purely animation, Transformers versus something like from the East or from Japan, like, the animations for action was not nearly the same level, right? The action in Japan was crazy. They were
a lot more duplicate frames in American animation.
Yeah,
as well.
exactly. There's so many. They would like reuse the same explosion over and over again. And then meanwhile in Japan,
Looking at you, G.I. Joe.
G.I. Joe, I was looking at like Transformers or the old Spider-Man, the one like do you remember the old Spider-Man?
Yes,
they had
yes,
the
one where
same,
he had the single swing through the
same
city animation.
yeah, the same. Or like I remember the Rhino had the same run animation that would show every time he'd like come onto screen.
Yeah,
and then meanwhile Japan's coming up with Akira, like this crazy animation that has like the best action and explosion and physics you've ever seen. Okay, so Penny and to me was an acknowledgement of like that kind of art style. And so her character was kind of basic in terms of they didn't give her a lot of moments, but the moments that they gave her were so strong, and like it was just enough to get her character to work. I want to see more of her. I hope she's in the next one. And they actually gave her a bunch of stuff in the background. So if you go back through this movie for whatever reason and you're freezing, you should watch every time Penny's in the background, because I feel like a lot of people gave her a lot of love because even though she didn't have much lines, they gave her as much love as possible, like when she's doing other stuff. So there's a scene when, especially when all the spider people fight all the villains at Aunt May's house, there's a lot of great stuff that she does while everyone else is talking or you're looking at someone else. You should just anyone else watching out there, check out that particular scene. And then okay, Miles, I don't think I really need to explain. The entire movie is about Miles, so he's obviously awesome. But I particularly like Peter B. Parker. Like, he's my favorite Spider-Man in the entire series and the entire Spider-Verse right now. Cause
just down on his luck, Spider-Man.
I just love that idea. Like, you just don't talk about that in heroes. Like, you see a little bit just recently in the latest adventure movies with Thor being like the kind of has-been hero and exploring that idea of what happens when you do the greatest thing of your life and then what happens after that, you know? And I love the idea of exploring a superhero that is like that has failed at stuff, like that has you've done things that are not the greatest. Yeah, like Watchmen style, or just that would be kind of considered a failure. But like the film showcases how like a message that's not often talked about is like how to pick yourself up after you missed your mark. It's Miles is at the beginning of his story, so like he hasn't done anything wrong. He's young. He has like all this opportunity. You can't fault him for failing, but Peter B. Parker is at a point where I think a lot of people might get in their lives where they've tried to do something and it hasn't worked out, and you don't see any recognition from that in the media that you see. It's always like either a hero right away or you're like a villain or right away. I like the acknowledgement of. It seems like it touched on a much more realistic point of life to have Peter B. Parker be like that. And the fact that they showed the good Parker was great too, because it was just like, it makes you so much more real, because you always have an idea of what the greatest person you could be is, right, in your head. And then he goes into that universe and he gets to actually see it, and it has to confront, like, it's such a poignant character point for him to be in that universe, because it confronts the exact thing that he's been so afraid of the entire life. So that whole character arc is so complete in this movie, and I think that he had the best one. He had the best line for me when he said, "Miles, it's just a leap of faith." I'm like, so many great things for him.
Yeah.
And then
he's also like the Spider-Man that it's not like he never was a good guy and he never did amazing things. It's just
it was harder
he got
on him.
Old, right? He's confronting like a middle-age crisis.
Yeah. He started to deal with all the middle-age stuff,
right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's what. Yeah, you're right. Like he was still Spider-Man, but like I would imagine the Spider-Man that died in the film is almost like your typical hero Spider-Man, where they've done everything right and they had this great life. But he represents another side where you've done all the things to be good, but the world isn't as kind to you and doesn't reward you, which it happens.
You just made the one mistake that just happened to be the last one.
Yeah, exactly, right? So I loved his character. And then Spider Noir, I think that's what they call them.
Spider-Man Noir.
Yeah, I just loved it with him because they essentially distilled all the different Spider people into their comic versions, and Spider Noir was supposed to represent those older comics during World War II and the Cold War, where the printing fidelity was quite low on newsprint, and so your characters would have to be often silhouetted completely in black or have really, really simple designs. And so that's what they did to his overall design, is because they just simplified it, made a lot of his shapes just black in shadow, and they kept like his aesthetic for his comic to translate over. And plus he was also like super funny. Like I didn't realize it was Nicolas Cage that played him for the longest time. I was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Nicolas Cage has been in the most variety of movies I've ever I think he's become a meme, but if you look at his like acting history, he's been in such a wide variety of films. It's astonishing.
Yeah, and he's kind of making a comeback in really good movies too, like Mandy, and I just watched The Color Out of Space 2 days ago, and it was amazing.
I feel like even the movies that people would say are bad, like you've seen them. Like, and and it's something that's like Face Off is one of the most ridiculous movies, but like who hasn't seen Face Off and seen the Face Off?
I really like Face Off.
It was a great movie,
Face Off is
right?
really fun.
It's a ridiculous movie, but it's a great movie, right? Yeah. Anyways, so I want to talk a little about the Spider-Verse people, but now I wanted to break down a bit about. So I talked a bit about the original art director moving on to the project. His name, if you go to the next page here, his name is, maybe you'll help me pronounce it, Alberto Mego. Is that how you pronounce it?
I don't know.
I don't even know if you would know how to pronounce it.
That's not a Brazilian name I'm familiar with.
Okay, so anyways, before he started doing the Spider-Verse, he actually worked on the animation Tron movie, which, I actually watched a little bit just for the designs, because it was the artwork and the cinematography was actually super strong.
Which one is this?
They made a Tron TV show, like for like a kids show.
Oh, really?
Like a 3D show. Yeah. So it was in the Tron universe. Tron, the character, was in it, but it was like a more stylized 3D Star Wars Rebels kind of look to it.
Okay.
But I looked at it after I saw this movie, and I was like, oh yeah, like you can already see
the influence,
cinematic like expertise that Alberto Miego has. And so he was the art director that put together the pitch for this, not the pitch, but the initial animation to prove out the story, to get the project started. And it's available all on his website, or if you go to Vimeo, just type in his name, Alberto Miego Spiderverse. He talks a bit about what happened in terms of him leaving, and then he also got permission to release this little, like, these 4 clips of what they presented to sell this idea of the Spider-Verse. Because imagine trying to pitch Spider-Verse like before anyone's seen what it is. Like, how do you kind of tell that you want to do this like risky animation style that no one's seen before? I highly recommend watching these 4 clips. Like, it's one of the most beautiful sequences I've ever seen. And we talked about how this movie boils down complex visuals, but makes it done cheaply and effectively. Essentially, what all these sequences are a bunch of hand-drawn sketches overlaid onto very simple Maya geometry using camera pans in Maya. So like they'll take a building and he'll just draw, like you can see in one of the screens there, the little lines to represent the building, and then they would overlay it with music and like just like super strong animation like drawings that you see there, and it sets up the entire movie. Like, if you look at these clips, they are the most important parts, the best parts of the movie. Like, the clip that you're seeing in this little image here, it's this is before the script was essentially locked down. We knew what the characters were going to be, and et cetera, et cetera. So all it is that they knew that they wanted to be in Miles Morales' universe. In this universe, Peter Parker has died, so it's just a little clip of him taking on the mantle, and they have Miles's montage moment, that famous, "What's up, danger" moment where he jumps off the building for the first time, right, and has the suit on. That whole sequence is in these little drawings that are in here, and if you watch this, it's like, not only did they keep this original feel of this shot, but everything that they added didn't take away from it. It added so much more and more. So if you go to the next frame, for example, this is a shot directly from the animatic that I'm talking about here, right? And you can even see here they're starting to use some of the effects we're talking about, like blurring, where you want to blur just so that you get motion, and then keeping one character in focus. And then you go to the next frame here. This is the shot that they used in the final movie.
Wow. Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Like they kept so much of it, and so the next few frames are just more and more examples of where this happens. So go to the next one, for example. This is a direct frame. Here, this is Spider-Man in the same moment too. This is the montage for the animatic. This is the montage that happens way later in the film.
Yeah.
And so, but if you watch it, the music is different, and it has such a different feel. Like I would be very interested if there was a movie with this kind of original feel too. You can see what Alberto Miago started with. It has a very super unique, like if you watch the sequence, you won't see this kind of like style with the music anywhere else. And I understand what they added into the final movie. When you watch it, you'll notice a difference. And the difference is that they added the Marvel side of it, the popular side of it, like the more mainstream elements of it. But they were able to keep the core raw goodness. And that's what actually shows up through the film. If you go to the next slide here again, it's just another slide right after that. And then go to the next one for a second here. Like this is that like super, super important moment where Miles is about to jump off.
Yeah, before he does the somersault.
Yeah, and the film that's in the animation has a bit more of a gritty sense to it. Go to the next frame for a second here. Like they cut in here to him remembering how Peter died. And so in this universe, Peter dies to that blast, but he has this much more visceral, like quick second burst where, showing Peter Parker like flesh like blowing up, that's pretty hardcore for Marvel, right?
Yeah.
So most likely not going to happen. That's why I would love to have seen this version of, though. It's so much more gritty, but it has that difference in it. But then if you go to the next slide here again, like the next few frames, in my opinion, which is some of the most impressive and beautiful frames in the entire film, were in the film the very moment of its conception. These next two slides that are in here, the hand breaking off here, the super backwards this shot with the environment upside down is just so stunning here.
Yeah, it looks like even flipped it 180 degrees upside down. So
so this is another. You see, that's the original idea, and then the final implementation is even better.
Yeah,
like they found a better camera angle that exaggerates the environment even more. It's so much more extreme, but it's the same concept, but it doesn't work worse. There's so many times where I see like you have this strong creative idea, let's say like Star Wars, for example, this great base, and you just see it diluted by like they wanted to do this, but every time they did this, they lost a little bit of what was the original like element. That's what blows my mind about this project, is that despite having so many people jump on top of it, everyone seemed to be respectful enough to respect that what they already have was so strong, and they didn't remove that. They could have easily like taken this shot and try to do something else with it, but they recognized, this is a credit to both the people who came after them, but also to Alberto Miago, that what he created was so goddamn strong already that they just needed to find a way to render it and capture it.
So how come he left the project then?
So I believe he talks about it. I don't want to say for him, but based on my understanding of his statement, it was essentially that Marvel wanted to make a Marvel movie, or like the production studios and Sony, not Marvel, sorry, Sony, because Sony is the one that created it, wanted to make a movie that was a bit more Marvel and a bit more PG. And if you watch the animatic, it's not like they're gross or anything like that, but it was clearly an even further pushed version of this movie, where we showed a few freeze frames of when they drew in kind of some color, some like actual comic frames, and they split it in there. In his version, I actually think it was great, but probably just a little too outside the box for like a large studio to be able to invest into, is that like he would go super heavy into the whole comic book frame thing. Some of the best sequences that is used in the movie, for example, when they, each Spider-Person has that this is my story kind of moment, and they're like, I'm Gwen, etc., etc., and they go into that comic book kind of
the flip
montage.
page.
Yeah. If you watch the animatic, that's all in there, and it's like the first time that you would ever see it so naturally cut together. And so they use the exact types of framing that they did in the animatic that they did in the final movie. There's like a shot with like Gwen running, and it has like a vertical frame split, and then even in this scene here, when Miles jumps off, there's a part where he's falling, and then it cuts to multiple vertical frames of him falling at the same time to get that kind of like feeling of him going do 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 do, like falling further and further and further. That was all in the original animatic too.
Very cool.
So like it set the groundwork for so much of what ended up being in the film. And I looked up this all this up when I was doing my own kind of like study on this kind of art direction, art style, because I was so impressed by how they were able to combine realistic 3D rendering techniques and textures, but then they found a way to like overlay this 2D style. Like it just makes so much sense for me as an artist. I'm like, man, that's crazy, because it also makes it easier to paint really complicated scenes if you like find a way to steal some of these techniques and like harness it yourself. So I did a bit of analysis, and I came up with this came up to Alberto Mego here, and man, like it blew my mind in terms of like how good this original, and it's just a few lines. Like the entire thing is like, you think that you could do it yourself. Obviously you couldn't, because it's like so much more complicated than that. But like the simplicity of it, you can see where like you can go into this meeting and be like, hey, look at what I did with just me and maybe a couple of other guys that are techs here. Like imagine the story that we can get if we can use this system and iterate. Like I think that's the key, is like it showcased how fast you can iterate an idea. If you can crank this out, this level of quality of animation with just like a few markers and stuff like that, it showcased like, okay, then, you know, when they go into the actual movie sequence or a production, because every movie production goes through the same kinds of cycles. You start rendering the story, you know, and then that render or that scene goes through review processes where they talk about, you know, are the characters moving properly? Are the characters lit properly? Does everything look right? Does everything feel right? And a good studio, like, you know, a high class animation studio like Pixar or something, will go through a lot of iterations where they'll send it back, and then, you know, we got to change this, and you don't know the results of your changes until you get it through that pipeline again. And just like in a video game, if your pipeline is super clean and fast, and you can see your gameplay changes as like the way they see their animation changes quickly, it's much faster to make like fixes. And so for them, they were able to probably preview their entire movie so early on in this simplified style, and they can start making the fixes while it was all cheap to do before they spent all the resources to build the models, blah, 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 blah. Because in a regular production, you might have someone that outsources all the buildings here, for example, but because they knew that all these shots, the buildings weren't like super close up, you can get away with hacking a bunch of lower textures and animation cheats that would still make it look good, if not better. But you don't have to animate it. You don't have to like spend all the resources over there. So it was just one of the greatest examples of like, I bet you like there's so much, the efficiency of the dollars that go onto the screen is so high in this project. And it was made here in Vancouver.
Yeah. And so it was very efficient because they don't pay animators all that much.
Well, it's just we don't have a massive, like, we don't have a Pixar level animation like background here.
Yeah.
But this movie to me is actually the best animated movie out there, at least right now, that I've seen.
I can definitely agree with you on that.
Right.
Barring something from like Studio Ghibli, right? Or something that they spent 7 years on, right?
If anything, it's arguable. And then you look at all the other studios that they're competing against, and like, man, they definitely have something special here. If you can come up with like, you know, like out of nowhere, this first project.
So distinct, right? And not have, like you said, not having a basis on everything. So much of it fell in this vision that you just don't see any other movie even attempting to get even close to this. You look at a DreamWorks movie, you look at a Pixar movie, and they sort of go for the same style. Sort of the characters might look a little different, but
yeah,
at least to me, you know, my untrained, unartist eye, it's sort of that same, oh, it's a 3D animated film.
Yeah.
Whereas this came out, and I was like, is this 2D? Is this 3D? It turns out to be, as you explained, a blend of everything that is wholly its own.
Yeah.
And
yeah. I think
what's
Pixar,
the state of the studio right now? Do they have another project in the works?
It's Spider-Verse 2 has already been announced a while ago, and I think they might have a year release date already. I don't know if they have an exact like month release date, and I know that the people are already working on it here in Vancouver. To your point about Pixar, I think that when Pixar first came out with some of their like really big hitters, like, you know, Finding Nemo and stuff, like that was when it was very unique. But then now that they've had a longer period of time to release more movies, people can see that now they're the routine in the type of storytelling in movies are right now. Like, and it's not bad. It was innovative for a time, but you can tell it's not that they're worried about making risks, but they have a particular flavor that they like to stick to. And what I loved about this movie, like, not just like before Black Panther, like the music in this movie is so goddamn good, and it's so unconventional in terms of what movie music they picked in this movie. Like, you know, you wouldn't expect there to be that much hip hop in a Marvel style movie before Black Panther, right? You know, so that was another thing I didn't even get a chance to talk about, but the soundtrack is complete fire. Like, holy jeez. So the ability that they didn't use a regular Marvel soundtrack during Miles's montage, like that
like
montage,
a cinematic sweeping score like the Avengers.
Yeah, they put it in a little bit in there. You can hear it that they like kind of have it in the background build up, but then they have that "What's Up Danger," this song that is actually like probably not, if you just put the song on, I'm pretty sure that they played so many songs that they had to change the actual words. For example, the song that he loves, that what's that song that he was, Sunflower. You know that song I'm talking about, right? They changed his lyrics, so in the movie he says the wrong lyrics by accident.
Oh.
But the real lyrics is like talking about picking up like prostitutes or something like that.
Oh.
Yeah. Because, you know, it's a hip hop movie, or it's a hip hop song, right? Like, obviously that's like, if he was a real kid, he would be listening to that kind of music for sure, right? So, but, you know, they did a little bit of
creative licensing,
not Disney-fying, but like, you know, like making it softer so that young audiences can watch it, which I completely understand, right? So yeah, that was pretty much it for me. I freaking love this movie so much. It taught me so much about art and animation, and it's kind of, I can see you can already see the inspiration. If you follow art in terms of like I follow a lot of artists and concept artists, you can already see that there's like a point in time before this movie, and there's a point in time after this movie where there's a certain style that's constantly out there now. Now everybody is incorporating halftones into 3D character models. Everybody, like all art style, and that, like, you know, everyone's obviously looked at this film and realized that it's a super strong point.
Sort of the Borderlands effect, where after 2006, everybody wanted to do that sort of like half cell shaded, half textured assets.
Yeah. Like they're gonna try the impressive thing for this movie was just that they not like, you can't point to one thing that they did super well that made the movie, because they executed so well on so many different elements. Even if you're just like a casual movie fan, like when have you ever seen such a succinct story that's a retelling of a story that I was honestly bored of hearing? I didn't want to hear more about Spider-Man's uncle, but Ben dying, or like, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Like the same thing with Batman. But they retold this story, but they had like multiple character arcs that were super, super strong. They picked a bunch of like music choices that were super rare, all in the background of doing the super crazy art style, and all executed to probably the best in the genre, arguably, at least, right? So yeah, I was just so impressed by this goddamn movie.
Yeah, I can tell. How do you think this is going to influence then movies coming up? Do you know of any projects that are following this sort of? Because it's saving them a lot of money. Then what's the argument then for them to do something more typical? Like, you look at the budgets on Pixar and DreamWorks movies, and they're through the roof. Timelines as well.
I bet you people will follow it, but I think that part of the movie's art style and style as a general is like it's one of those things that you need a master to really wield it properly. You know, like I think that there's a lot of things that people could copy and they'll grab bits and pieces of it, but you know, we talked about that little example of the halftoning and then using all those weaknesses in your project but building tools to overcome them and then essentially make them the unique attributes of them. That's something that like it's not about whether you do this art style or another style. It's whether your team and the person who's directing it has the, you know, creative capacity and problem solving ability to be able to do that in a project.